Welcome to Real Point English Stories. We're excited to have you with us today for another fun and educational adventure. In this story, we'll be taking a thrilling tour of the UK, visiting famous landmarks, and learning lots of useful English along the way. Whether you're just starting to learn English or want to improve your skills, this story is perfect for you. Sit back, relax, and let your imagination take you to the heart of the UK. Get ready to explore, learn new words, and enjoy this exciting journey with us. Let's begin. Here is an extended version of the first chapter of your story, expanding the narrative while still using simple English for beginners. Chapter 1. The Journey Begins. It was the last day of school before our long holiday break. We were all sitting in the classroom, talking excitedly about what we would do during our time off. Our teacher, Mr. Johnson, had a big surprise for us. He stood in front of the class with a wide smile on his face and said, "Class, we are going on a tour of some of the most famous places in the UK." We couldn't believe it. The whole class started cheering. A tour of the UK. It sounded like a dream come true. Some of us had never even left our town before, so this was going to be a big adventure. The next morning, we all met at the school. We were carrying our backpacks packed with food, drinks, and everything we needed for the trip. The school had arranged a large bus just for us. The bus was shiny and new, and it had big windows so we could see everything as we traveled. Mr. Johnson checked to make sure everyone was there. He counted each student as we climbed onto the bus. The engine roared to life, and the bus slowly started moving. We waved goodbye to our school and our town as we headed for London, the capital city of the UK. The journey would take a few hours, but we didn't mind. We were too excited to feel bored. As the bus drove through the countryside, we looked out of the windows. The fields were bright green, and there were sheep and cows grazing in the grass. The sky was blue with fluffy white clouds, and the sun was shining brightly. It was the perfect day for a trip. Some of us started talking about what we wanted to see the most. Jack, who sat next to me, said, "I can't wait to see Big Ben. I heard it's really big and loud." Sarah, who was sitting across from us, said, "I want to see Buckingham Palace. Maybe we'll see the Queen." We all laughed, but deep down we were hoping we would catch a glimpse of her too. After a few hours of driving, we finally arrived in London. It was a busy city with lots of tall buildings, cars, and people everywhere. It was so different from our quiet little town. The streets were filled with buses, taxis, and people walking quickly, like they were in a hurry to get somewhere important. Our first stop was Big Ben, one of the most famous landmarks in London. As we got off the bus, we could see the tall clock tower in the distance. It stood high above the other buildings, and it looked even bigger than we had imagined. "Wow! Look at that!" someone shouted, pointing to the tower. We all looked up, and there it was. Big Ben, standing tall and proud against the blue sky. The clock face was huge, with its hands slowly moving around, telling the time. The tower had beautiful designs carved into the stone, and it seemed to reach all the way to the clouds. Mr. Johnson gathered us around and said, "Big Ben is over 150 years old. It was built in 1859, and it's one of the most famous clocks in the world. Every hour the bell inside the tower rings, and you can hear it all over London." We stood there for a few minutes, just staring at the clock. It was hard to believe we were really here, standing in front of such a famous place. Mr. Johnson told us we could walk around and take pictures, so we all pulled out our cameras and phones. Some of us took selfies with the tower in the background, while others tried to get the whole tower in one picture. It was difficult because it was so tall. As we continued to look at Big Ben, the bell suddenly rang. Dong, dong. The sound was deep and loud, and we could feel it in our chests. It was like the whole city stopped for a moment to listen to the sound of Big Ben. After taking in the view of Big Ben, we walked a little further down the road to the Houses of Parliament. This is where the leaders of the UK meet to make important decisions for the country. The building was huge and very impressive. It was made of stone, with tall towers and big windows. We could see people going in and out of the building, and there were guards standing at the entrance, making sure everything was safe. Mr. Johnson explained, "The Houses of Parliament is where the government works. It has two parts, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. This is where laws are made, and it's a very important place for the country." We couldn't go inside, but just seeing the outside of the building was enough. It looked like something from a history book. We walked around the area, looking at the different statues and fountains. There were so many things to see, and we tried to take it all in. Our next stop was Buckingham Palace, the home of the Queen. We were all very excited about this because Buckingham Palace is one of the most famous royal buildings in the world. As we arrived, we could see the palace from a distance. It was big and grand with golden gates at the front. There were tall flagpoles, and the Union Jack flag was flying high in the wind, which meant the Queen was at home. We stood outside the palace and watched the changing of the guard. This is a special ceremony where the soldiers who guard the palace are replaced by new ones. The soldiers were wearing bright red uniforms and tall black hats made of bearskin. They marched in perfect lines, moving together as if they were one. It was amazing to watch. Mr. Johnson told us, "The changing of the guard happens every day at Buckingham Palace. These soldiers are here to protect the Queen and the royal family. They have to stand very still while they are on duty, and they take their job very seriously." We took more pictures in front of the palace, and some of us even pretended to be guards, standing still with serious faces. It was a lot of fun. After visiting Buckingham Palace, we walked to Westminster Abbey. This is a very old and important church in London. Kings and queens are crowned here, and many famous people are buried inside. The building was large and beautiful, with tall towers and huge windows made of colorful stained glass. The light from the sun shone through the windows, creating patterns of color on the floor. Inside the abbey, we saw statues of kings, queens, and other important people from British history. Mr. Johnson pointed out the tomb of a famous king and told us about his life. It was interesting to learn about the history of the people who had once ruled the country. As we walked around, we noticed how quiet and peaceful it was inside the abbey. It felt like a place of great importance, and we all tried to be respectful as we explored. After a busy morning of sightseeing, we were all starting to feel a little tired. Mr. Johnson suggested we take a break and have lunch. We found a beautiful park nearby with green grass and tall trees. We spread out our picnic blankets and sat down to eat our sandwiches and snacks. The sun was warm, and a gentle breeze was blowing through the trees. It was the perfect spot to relax and recharge before continuing our tour. As we ate, we talked about everything we had seen so far. Everyone had their favorite moment. Some loved seeing Big Ben, while others couldn't stop talking about Buckingham Palace. We all agreed that this was the best school trip we had ever been on. Chapter 2: Exploring the Tower of London and the London Eye. After a relaxing lunch in the park, we felt recharged and ready for more adventure. Mr. Johnson gathered us around and said, "Next, we're going to the Tower of London, one of the oldest and most famous castles in the UK. Are you ready to learn some more history?" We all cheered, excited to see the ancient castle we had heard so much about. We quickly packed up our picnic blankets, grabbed our bags, and made our way back to the bus. The ride to the Tower of London wasn't very long, but we couldn't wait to get there. As we drove through the busy streets of London, we passed by more beautiful old buildings, tall glass towers, and bustling markets filled with people. When we arrived at the Tower of London, it was even more impressive than we had imagined. The large stone walls stood tall and strong, and it felt like we had stepped back in time. The tower has been there for over 900 years, and it was once used as a palace, a prison, and a fortress. Now, it's a museum where people can come to see the famous crown jewels and learn about British history. Mr. Johnson led us through the massive gates, and we walked over a bridge that crossed the tower moat. "Look how deep the moat is," Jack said. "Can you imagine trying to escape from here in the old days?" Inside the tower grounds, we saw large stone buildings, high walls, and watchtowers. There were even men dressed as guards, wearing traditional uniforms from hundreds of years ago. They stood tall and serious, just like the soldiers we saw at Buckingham Palace. Our first stop was the White Tower, the central building of the Tower of London. It was built by William the Conqueror, a king from many centuries ago. The building was huge, with thick stone walls and small windows. We learned that kings and queens used to live here, and it was also used to store weapons and treasure. Inside, we climbed a steep staircase and explored the rooms where kings once slept and held important meetings. It felt strange to think about all the history that had happened right where we were standing. Then came the part we were all waiting for: the crown jewels. These are some of the most valuable treasures in the world. They include crowns, swords, and other royal items used in special ceremonies. Mr. Johnson told us that the jewels are still used today for events like the coronation of the king or queen. We walked into a special room, and there, behind thick glass, were the crown jewels. The crowns were covered in sparkling diamonds, rubies, and other precious stones. There was a long golden scepter with a big diamond on top, and a beautiful crown made for the queen. We couldn't believe how shiny and bright everything looked. It was like something from a fairy tale. After we finished looking at the jewels, we explored the rest of the tower. Mr. Johnson told us stories about famous prisoners who were kept here long ago. Some of them were kings and queens who had fallen out of favor. We even saw the ravens of the tower, big black birds that have lived here for many years. Legend says that if the ravens ever leave, the tower will fall. As the afternoon went on, it was time to leave the Tower of London. But our adventure wasn't over yet. Mr. Johnson had one more exciting stop planned for us, the London Eye. The London Eye is a giant Ferris wheel on the banks of the River Thames. It has large glass capsules that you can sit in, and from the top, you can see all of London. We had seen it from a distance earlier in the day, and now we were going to ride it. When we arrived at the London Eye, it was even bigger up close. The wheel slowly turned in the sky, and we watched as the capsules moved higher and higher until they reached the top. "I'm a little scared of heights," Sarah whispered to me. "But this looks so fun." We all climbed into one of the glass capsules, and before we knew it, we were rising into the sky. The higher we went, the more of London we could see. The river below sparkled in the sunlight, and we could see boats moving slowly along the water. From up here, Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament looked small, like toys. We could even see Buckingham Palace in the distance. Everyone was quiet for a moment as we took in the amazing view. "This is incredible," Jack said. "You can see the whole city." Mr. Johnson smiled and said, "This is one of the best ways to see London. You can see landmarks, parks, and even the countryside in the distance." We stayed at the top of the London Eye for a few minutes before slowly making our way back down to the ground. When we stepped out of the capsule, we were all talking excitedly about how amazing it was to see the city from so high up. It felt like we were flying. By the time we finished, it was getting late, and we were all feeling tired from the day's adventure. Mr. Johnson led us back to the bus, and we took one last look at the London skyline before climbing aboard. As the bus drove us back to our hotel, we talked about everything we had seen that day. From Big Ben to Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London to the London Eye, it had been an unforgettable experience. We learned so much about the history and culture of the UK, and we couldn't wait to see what the next day would bring. As the bus gently hummed along the road, I leaned back in my seat, closed my eyes, and thought about all the amazing places we had visited. I knew that this trip would be something I'd remember for a long time. Chapter 3. A Journey to Stonehenge and the English Countryside. The next day began with a cool breeze and clear skies, perfect for our next adventure. After a good night's rest, we were ready to continue our tour of the UK. We all gathered in the hotel lobby, buzzing with excitement. Mr. Johnson had promised that today we would visit one of the most mysterious and ancient places in England, Stonehenge. Once again, we boarded the bus. This time, the ride would take a little longer, as Stonehenge was located outside of London, deep in the countryside. We didn't mind, though. The view outside the window was beautiful. As the city disappeared behind us, we saw miles and miles of green fields, rolling hills, and farms with sheep and cows. Mr. Johnson gave us some background about Stonehenge as we drove. Stonehenge is a prehistoric monument, he explained. It was built over 4,000 years ago, and no one knows exactly why or how it was built. The huge stones were moved from far away, but people at the time didn't have the technology we have now. It's one of the world's greatest mysteries. We listened carefully, fascinated by the thought of visiting such an ancient and mysterious place. After a couple of hours, we finally arrived. As we stepped off the bus, we could already see the giant stones in the distance, standing tall against the bright blue sky. Stonehenge was surrounded by a large field of green grass. There were no tall buildings, no roads nearby, just nature and this ancient circle of stones. It felt peaceful and quiet. We walked slowly toward the monument, taking in the beauty of the landscape around us. As we got closer, the stones seemed even larger. Some were standing tall, while others had fallen to the ground over the years. The stones were arranged in a circle, and they looked heavy and powerful. It was hard to believe that people so long ago had managed to move them here, without the help of modern machines. "Wow, this is amazing," Sarah whispered. "How did they do it?" Mr. Johnson smiled. "That's the big question. Some people think it was used for religious ceremonies, others think it was a type of calendar. But no one knows for sure. What we do know is that the stones are perfectly aligned with the movements of the sun, especially during the summer and winter solstices." As we walked around the stones, we noticed how quiet it was. There were other tourists there too, but everyone seemed to be speaking softly, as if they didn't want to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. It felt like we were stepping back in time, to a world very different from our own. Jack, who loved anything related to history, asked, "Do you think people back then used Stonehenge to predict the seasons?" "It's possible," Mr. Johnson said. "Stonehenge lines up perfectly with the sunrise on the longest day of the year, the summer solstice. People would come here to watch the sun rise between the stones. It was probably a very special event." We walked around the monument, taking photos and listening to Mr. Johnson tell us more about the history of Stonehenge. He told us that some of the stones came from Wales, which was over 150 miles away. No one knew how they had transported such heavy stones all that way. After spending time exploring Stonehenge, we sat on the grass nearby and had a small picnic. The sun was warm and the breeze was cool, making it the perfect day to sit and relax. We ate our sandwiches and fruit, enjoying the calmness of the countryside. As we finished our lunch, we noticed some people standing on a small hill not far from Stonehenge. Mr. Johnson explained that the area around Stonehenge was full of ancient burial mounds. People had been buried here thousands of years ago, and archaeologists had found many important artifacts in the area. It's incredible to think how much history is buried beneath our feet, Mr. Johnson said. Every time they dig here, they find more clues about the people who lived in this area long ago. After a few more minutes of resting, we packed up our things and got back on the bus. Our next destination was a small, picturesque village in the English countryside called Laycock. Mr. Johnson said it was famous for its old stone houses, narrow streets, and peaceful atmosphere. The drive to Laycock took us through more beautiful countryside. We passed small farms with stone walls and fields full of flowers. The hills rolled gently, and everything was so green and fresh. It was a big change from the busy streets of London. When we arrived in Laycock, it felt like we had stepped into a storybook. The houses were made of stone and had thatched roofs, the kind you see in old paintings. There were no tall buildings, no noisy cars, just a quiet village full of charm and history. We walked through the narrow streets, taking in the sights. There were small shops selling handmade goods, old pubs with wooden signs, and flower boxes on every window. It was a quiet and peaceful place, and we could hear the sound of birds chirping in the trees. "Isn't this place amazing?" Sarah said. "It feels like we're in a different world." "It does," I agreed. "I could imagine living here. It's so peaceful." Mr. Johnson took us to one of the most famous places in Laycock, Laycock Abbey. It was an old medieval building that had once been a monastery. Now it was a museum where people could learn about the history of the area. The abbey had large stone walls, beautiful gardens, and long arched hallways that seemed to go on forever. We explored the abbey, learning about the monks who had lived there hundreds of years ago. We saw old manuscripts, paintings, and even some medieval clothing. The abbey had also been used as a filming location for many famous movies and TV shows, including parts of Harry Potter, which made some of the students very excited. After spending the afternoon in Laycock, we all felt like we had experienced a piece of England's rich history. The quiet village and the ancient abbey had given us a glimpse into what life must have been like hundreds of years ago. As the day came to an end, we boarded the bus one last time and began our journey back to the hotel. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. We were tired but happy, having seen so many amazing places in just one day. On the ride back, we talked about our favorite moments of the day. Some of us loved the mystery of Stonehenge, while others enjoyed the charm of Laycock. We all agreed that the English countryside was one of the most beautiful places we had ever seen. Mr. Johnson reminded us that we still had more to explore tomorrow, and we could hardly wait to see what the next day's adventure would bring.